One of the things I want Colombian people to understand, and it's very hard for them for us to understand, is that peace is a long process, and the difficulties are not obstacles of the peace process, but part of the peace process.
Yeah.
The peace process in itself
Yeah.
is facing difficulties.
It's a process.
It's a process.
Yeah.
And I have seen, and I still believe, that the difficulties that the Irish people had overcome are way harder than the ones we do, in spite of the fact that ours is quite edgy.
Yeah.
But I mean, one cannot imagine the things you guys had to deal with. So I started studying, and I always dreamed of going to Ireland. Always dreamed of it was such a way that when I went there, the song I had in my mind was a sort of homecoming from YouTube.
Right.
Like I was going to return to a place I've never been before.
Yeah.
And that way I accomplished my dream to go to Ireland long before. I mean, a very, very long trip.
Right.
And I had the chance to speak to people in Northern Ireland. I arrived to Belfast. And I saw especially the walls, the painting on the walls.
Yeah.
And I saw, and that is what really gave me the hope. I saw the way the Irish people started perceiving that the country was changing.
Yeah.
Bit by bit. It's not going to be as a whole. And we were walking with Miss Brecht, and then she said, police, something happened. And it was a parade of the Eastern Rebellion in Northern Ireland, right there in Belfast. Everybody dressed like in 1916. And the police was escorting them. And she said, something is changing in this country. Few years ago, they would have been shooting at them. And now, they are protecting the... And she said, the guys with the gray hair are IRA people. And it was in the middle of Belfast. And I saw that the walls are still there, but people take pictures instead of killing themselves.
Yeah, there's a huge change.
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe the scenario is still the same, but the relationships among the people are very different.
No, I think that's right. I think if you go back in time, the two communities, you'd go to a different school, you'd go to a different church, you'd play a different sport. And I remember one of my friends worked for one of the big accountancy firms, and she had 2 business cards, and depending on which community she thought you were from, you'd get a business card with one address, and if she thought you were the other. And so the segregation was huge, and it's very easy in that type of situation to have a negative view of the other, because you don't really meet them. And when the preconditions, I suppose, really for the peace process began and people started stepping over the boundary, then people began to get to know each other and see what they had in common rather than what they had as a difference. So for me, while the police and the military reduced the level of violence, what started building peace was when people started stepping across the boundaries and working with each other, and then the political space was opening up, which then allowed some of the what ultimately ended up as being the Good Friday Agreement. But as long as the communities were not talking to each other and were not understanding each other, and were not interrogating each other's narratives of what was going on, then it's very difficult to build peace, which I think why some of the approaches that are being talked about here in Colombia are really important, because they are about telling people, it's okay to tell your story and to share it, and for the truth to come out. And there are different versions of the truth, of course, but at least if we put them on the table, then we can interrogate and debate and create a common understanding, because we're basing it on people's stories and narratives and what actually happened to them.
Yeah, and one of the things I was very curious about the Ireland story was, how did they deal with the bitterness, with the hatred, with all those ill memories? Because we were in the middle of, and we still are in the middle of the bitterness of the war. So I was trying to get that in, and when I found all this hope, like small solutions for great problems.
Yeah. And one of the things which we were involved with a few years ago was what we called Lives Entwined, which was a series of articles where people wrote their own full story, and in telling the whole story, they were able to say, well, actually, I'm a bit more complicated than people think. It was able to show that actually that segregation wasn't complete, and people have multiple identities and are slightly more complicated. So if you go back in my family history,
Where are you from?
well, both my parents are from Dingle in the southwest, in Kerry, so a Gaelic-speaking area, and so
You're Catholic.
yes, from the south. The simple version of the family story is, we've been, farming there for centuries, but of course, there's a relative who was an admiral in the Royal Navy. So we're all a bit more complicated than the simple version of history or the simple version of the family story, and and it's being able to talk about that, and for somebody like myself who's sort of has lived in Britain for a long time, and I'm very happily British, and also happen to be Irish, also happen to be European, and also happen to be a citizen of the world, I suppose, if that phrase exists. Just being comfortable with those multiple identities and not feeling that you're better than anyone else because you have a particular identity. It's fine to be proud of your identity. Just as it's very fine for somebody else to be proud of their identity. And just being able to share those stories and talk about it, and talk about what it's really like to be you as an individual in this community, in this part of Ireland or Colombia or South Africa, and just tell those stories, and where we can create that dialogue and create those connections, then we're in a position where good things happen. Where people don't talk and they don't engage and they're separate, then it's very hard to find a historical example where isolation helped resolve a problem.
Yeah, I had a wonderful experience. I talked with the driver of the bus. This was my bus. The driver that was Catholic, and the driver that was Protestant.
Yeah.
The driver that was Catholic, he was talking about the way he was brought, and he said that when he was a young boy, he admired very much the IRA, but when he became a father, he said, "This is not a project for my children because the only project is death. In the end, the only thing that is guaranteed is death. Do I really want that for my children?" And he started watching them in another view, and he started believing in peace, and he said that. He said something is changing in this country. That's something I heard all over the trip. People saying something is changing in this country. But then when we crossed the border, the invisible border to Northern Ireland, I started playing the U2 songs. So I played like a song, and I played Sunday Bloody Sunday, and the driver got upset. And he said that he felt that those songs were only one version. And I said, well, I am trying to explain to my people your history. So if you would be kind enough to tell me your version, you would really help me and help us, and I would be honored. And he says, okay, we will have breakfast tomorrow at 7. I knew that there was a secret order that Catholics would not have any job in Northern Ireland. It was like an unspoken apartheid. I know it did. I know it happened. So what they told them was that Catholics didn't want to work and just want to spend the money of the government by having a lot of children. And that's exactly the way prejudice are taught to children.
Exactly.
So when I heard his version, like a raw version of what he was being told in school, and you knew there was a political deal deep under the table to create a segregation. So you see, like the origin of how prejudice are born, which is what's happening now with the immigrants. It's criminalizing the poverty of the other when there's a whole project for that poverty to be so.
I'm an immigrant in Britain, of course, and I moved over in 1984, and that was a time when the Troubles were very active. There were bombs being placed in supermarkets, in shopping centres, in England, and But at no point did I ever feel that anybody was saying, you're one of those. You have a collective responsibility for what's going on. It's your fault. And I think for me that was one of the very encouraging things about British society, that it was very welcoming of immigrants, but also sophisticated enough to draw a distinction between a small proportion of people who were engaged in violence and the vast majority of people who didn't support it, even if they were of the same community. And I think my hope is that, in the peace process, which is ongoing, and this idea of making sure that the different communities can continue to engage, continue to understand each other, and that there isn't stereotyping going on is really important. I think for me that's a very important underlying part in any process of reconciliation, is creating multiple opportunities for people to meet, and multiple opportunities in different dimensions, so that rather than being in a situation where somebody, I haven't met somebody like that ever, and then maybe you meet through a shared interest, let's imagine it's sport, but also there might be a shared interest which is politics, or shared interest which is fishing or cookery or whatever, and suddenly we realise that we're multi-dimensional human beings, and actually we're very similar on 9 of them, and there's one of them we happen to be different on, and that's okay.
And that's okay,
and that's okay. Whereas if we don't know each other at all, or we only talk about the thing that we're different.
And in the situation of polarization like we are, we are in the middle of that. I had all this high hope of what I saw in Ireland, and the way they start dealing with the problems bit by bit, and I came with a huge hope of what type of difficulties we were going to face after we signed the peace and we ratify it for the implementation. I came with my mind placed on the implementation. So I came a week before the peace signature. I was invited to Cartagena. I was very thrilled, and then a week later we lost the referendum, and I mean there was no way I could have imagined that such a thing could happen. So many of the things that I was in my mind with just they wouldn't do if the referendum wouldn't ratify the peace agreements.
Right.
But then we saw a civil society emerging out of the despair, all these youngsters in the streets, and it was very and really making the Congress and forcing the Congress to sign to ratify the agreement so that we can get to implementation.
Somewhere on my phone I have a photograph of myself with 2 young deputy ministers in Northern Ireland, one of whom is from one community and she's 24 at the time of the photograph, and the other from the other community and he's 30. And what I love about that photograph is 2 things. One is that it exists. Here are 2 deputy ministers from the 2 different communities working together. I'm in the photograph, and when I was young I would never have travelled north because the troubles are up there. I'm staying down here, thank you very much. But also, being aged 24 and 30, both those young politicians are too young to remember the violence. So from a position 20 years ago where people were fighting very hard and a lot of young people remembered nothing but violence, now we're in a position where we have young people engaged in politics who don't remember it because they were too young. And that's where the hope is. And that's where, for me, one of the important things for Colombia is to realise that there's at least a 20-year journey. Some things will happen very quickly, other things will take more time. But in 20 years' time, there'll be a photograph. You will have a photograph on your phone, and the photograph will be a photograph which would not be possible today. And that's what's exciting. Somewhere on my phone I have a photograph of myself with two young deputy ministers in Northern Ireland, one of whom is from one community and she's 24 at the time of the photograph, and the other from the other community and he's 30. And what I love about that photograph is two things. One is that it exists. You know, here are two deputy ministers from the two different communities working together. I'm in the photograph, and when I was young, I would never have travelled north because the troubles are up there. I'm staying down here, thank you very much. But also, being aged 24 and 30, both those young politicians are too young to remember the violence. Mm-hmm. So from a position 20 years ago, where people were fighting very hard and a lot of young people remembered nothing but violence, now we're in a position where we have young people engaged in politics who don't remember it because they were too young. And that's where the hope is. And that's where, for me, one of the important things for Colombia is to realise that there's at least a 20-year journey. Some things will happen very quickly, other things will take more time. But in 20 years' time, there'll be a photograph. You will have a photograph on your phone, and the photograph will be a photograph which would not be possible today. Yeah. And that's what's exciting.